but I hope that you can all still hear me. Does everything sound okay still? Okay. So that might just go on for a little bit, but it'll be cleared off in a second. So can everyone see my screen yet? No? Here we go. Okay. So hello everyone. Uh, Welcome to our Efficiency for Access Design Challenge webinar series. We're excited to have you all here today, whether live or if you're watching this recording later down the line. My name is Sean. I'm on the Efficiency for Access Design Challenge team, and you may be used to seeing my face at this point, but as usual, I'll be hosting this webinar today. And I'm joined today by my colleague Emil, who will be supporting the facilitation of this webinar, particularly in the chat. So if you would like to address us without messaging the whole group, feel free to address your messages towards Emil. That's his name in the chat as well. So as usual, a bit of housekeeping before we begin. I'm recording this webinar and its transcript, which will be available online. So if you do not wish to be recorded, please turn off your video and or mute yourself. We will share the recording and slides with you following the event. So today we'll be hearing from 4 wonderful speakers. When they are presenting, please turn off your video and mute yourself to avoid any distractions. However, you're free to turn on both for our Q&A portion of the event. If you do have a question during the Q&A period, please use the hand raising function at the bottom of the screen. It might be connected to a reactions button. Just click that and a raise hand function will appear. Additionally, the chat will be open to questions and comments from our audience throughout the event, and those can be sent in somewhat anonymously to Emil or to the whole room to maybe get a discussion going. So I encourage our speakers as well to participate in the chat if they have a chance. Today's panel is actually full to the brim with a wide range of expertise and experience. So I'd encourage you all to ask as many questions you can think of. You won't get many chances to interact with so many experts from so many different backgrounds as well anytime soon. So remember, this year's webinars are organized around the different elements of the assessment criteria. So these will be things that you will have to address in your own project whenever the time comes, just for you to keep in mind. Can everyone see my screen? Yes? Okay. So today's session is our second session in our series of on social impact. As mentioned in the criteria, judges will want to see how you have researched the needs of the people your solution could benefit, and particularly how you have considered social inclusion and equality in your design. Specifically, you'll want to address the question highlighted here. How well has your design considered the SDGs, commitment to leave no one behind, considering gender equality and disability inclusion? This is found in your challenge brief if you want to refer to it later, but just so you know. So today's session will focus on social inclusion, why it's important, how one can begin to understand the needs of different people and consider them in design and uptake of technologies, and finally, what considering social inclusion in design looks like. In the Efficiency for Access Design Challenge, we recognize the need for globally responsible design, and that it's central to this is inclusivity. We cannot question how else we might build our cities if people are not involved in shaping that vision. We can't rethink food supplies unless the farmers and consumers of food are part of the debate. And we cannot consider whether or how we travel unless those who need to get from A to B are also given the opportunity to define what they need. Engineers and designers alone cannot address the significant global challenges we face, and we must work in collaboration with others to achieve this. This includes design for specific needs, whether this means a specific context, such as a humanitarian or school setting, or designing for a specific demographic, such as women or a person with disabilities. Your design may vary greatly depending on how you ensure your design is suitable for all, and you must ensure to consider deeply how you will value people's perspectives in the design process, and how we value lived experience in the decision that you may impact people's lives. This empathetic approach is essential to ensure that people with lived experience of the issues you're trying to solve and may use your appliance are not just passive recipients, but actively heard within the shaping or designing of what application or the system is. The webinar's agenda is here. We only have about an hour for today's session, and we'll be hearing from 4 speakers. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to them and get things kicked off. First, we'll be hearing from Sheree Conibear. Sheree has almost 20 years experience working in monitoring, evaluation, and learning for international projects. She currently manages the monitoring and evaluation function for the £22 million FCDO and IKEA Foundation funded Low Energy Inclusive Appliance Program, LEA for short, that aims to improve the efficiency, affordability, and availability of solar-powered appliances for off and weak grid contexts. Sorry, let me just change this slide. She also manages the M&E component for our 2-year EEP Africa funded project in Tanzania that is training solar sister entrepreneurs to sell productive use of energy equipment. The aim is to test this distribution channel for reaching last mile customers, leading to learning and scale up. She was previously the technical operations lead for the monitoring and reporting hub managed service for the FCDO 1.2 billion Prosperity Fund. The fund aims to achieve economic development, poverty reduction, job creation, and gender and inclusion through a focus on many sectors in different countries, such as in different contexts, such as anti-corruption, fraud, and justice, education, health, and financial services. She has a vast amount of MEAL experience, both on the groundwork and at government policy level, which enables her to have oversight of what works and what doesn't in practice. Her knowledge includes extensive support to other countries, including budget reviews, work plans, capacity building, VFM, primary and secondary benefits, gender training for gender integration in projects, and MEL frameworks. She has worked with a range of donors, including ECHO, OFTA, USAID, DFID, FCO, and UNICEF. Okay, next we'll hear from Jennye Greene. Jennye works as a managing partner for Sustainable Energy Solutions, LLC, a consulting firm established in 1996, where she is specialized in gender and energy-related assignments, mostly in Africa. Her professional projects span policy, finance, enterprise development, and environmental sustainability. She has a master's from Columbia University in Climate and Society and a bachelor's degree from Brown University in International Relations. She speaks French and Arabic and lives in the southeastern United States in the same town where she was born, buttressed by family, including 2 young children and a husband with a restaurant, a mixed flock of poultry, a large dog, and a cherished vegetable garden. So welcome, Jennye. Then we'll be hearing shortly from Minter-Kemp, who isn't here yet, but will be joining us for a little brief section between these larger talks. Will's also with the Energy Saving Trust and joined over a year ago and has worked on a number of projects already, from supporting local authorities, implementation of charge points, to helping clean tech startups hit the market. One particular project of note has been looking into what challenges disabled consumers will face when transitioning to electric vehicles and what can be done to support an equitable transition to low carbon vehicles in the UK. Finally, we'll be hearing from Oluwadamilare Aluko. Oluwadamilare is a microgrid project developer at Gommyr Power Networks, where he engages stakeholders and manages various microgrid projects. His work focuses on project scene setup, conceptualization, and development of renewable powered microgrids, as well as other decentralized low carbon energy technologies. He also handles offer preparation, business development, and financial structuring for commercial and industrial clients. Oluwadamilare also uses machine learning and advanced spatial geoprocessing techniques to extract renewable microgrid intelligence from satellite imagery. Oluwadamilare has experience designing and installing residential and commercial solar PV systems and large energy storage banks, as well as project development and rural microgrids in Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Republic of Benin. He is also experienced in the development of smart electricity meters and control technologies. So I've been talking for quite a long time now, but we should get the session going and hear from our first speaker. So without further ado, why don't you take it away, Sheree? Speak when you're ready, and I'll get your slides ready.
Hi everyone. Very excited to be here today. I am excited to share my information and knowledge with you of my work on gender and inclusion over the last 20 years. I won't go into introducing myself. Sean, you've already done that, so we can skip that slide. I have a lot of slides and I'm excited to share with you. So I'm going to talk to you first of all about why it's important to us as LEA, as a program, to incorporate gender and inclusion in the policy and be committed to leave no one behind, and why that's important to us, and how you integrating it into your projects will at the government level. The second point I'm going to focus on is how does LEA incorporate gender and inclusion? How should you include gender inclusion in your projects? What do we mean when we talk about SDG 5? So how does LEA contribute to SDG 5 and how you should contribute to SDG 5? And then number 6, as I'm a monitoring and evaluation expert, how we plan to integrate gender and inclusion and how we can measure those results at the end of our work. Okay, so without further ado, let's go and start with the first slide. Okay, so program alignment with international and UK commitments. So I'm going to go through these quite fast. So first of all programs that are funded by UK government and also other governments, I'm sure, but we're talking about our project LEA. It has to integrate gender inclusion. So it's essential in order for accelerating programs towards the pledge that we've made, which is leave no one behind. So we're ensuring that we're in line with our 2030 agenda on sustainable development, and we're ensuring inclusive growth, because as to ensure economic growth, we're talking about everybody that's in the community. So that's men, women and children, people, minorities, people with disability, could be refugees, it could be people migrating. So everybody is included, and that's what we mean about economic development. The second point is that G&I is key to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We have Sustainable Development Goals number 5, so we know that we have 7, and number 5 focuses on gender and equality and women's empowerment, and we have to make sure we include that.
Hi, Sheree.
So looking at the UN, yeah.
You're breaking up a little bit. So do you mind turning off your video maybe to help in the connection?
Oh, perhaps that would be okay. Let me try that then. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So it's really important for us that we're in line with government policies. So when we mean gender inclusion, we mean age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, origins, religion, any other anyone that's included within the economy. The third point is the UK aid strategy. So it states that throughout all of its development spending, the government will continue to prioritise the needs of girls and women. So no country can develop successfully if half of the population is left behind. And that's according to the British government, the HM Treasury document in 2015. And I can share these documents with you. And then differed in FCO, but now they're merged, so they're FCDO, so the Economic Development Strategy that they published in 2017. You will find on page 21. We will build on the recommendations of the UN High-Level Panel on Women's Economic Empowerment. So all our economic development work will tackle gender discrimination and work to deliver safe, more secure and high returns work for women. So this is why we have to be in line, especially when we're using government money to implement our projects. There is a UK legal requirement, so good international development practices do enhance the value for money in our results. Okay, so now we can jump to the next slide. Okay, so when we're saying leave no one behind, and I think I'm just going to take a second here to give you 1 second, try and get my headphones on, which might even be better if you can't hear me. So when we're saying leave no one behind, what do we mean? So I'm going to give you just a practical example from my work on the ground when I used to work for UNICEF in the refugee camps. And as much as we tailored lots of our interventions to make sure that everybody gets use the wash facilities, everybody's able to get bread, everybody's able to get food. Most often what we would miss is we would notice in these situations that most of the women and girls would be losing out. So while lots of people stood in line to get food or stood in line to get bread, women would have children, so they wouldn't be able to stand in line for long hours, or there would be people with disability who would not be able to go the distance to queue up for food or coupons within the refugee crisis and situations I'd worked in. So most often I could see on the ground that although we tried to include everyone, not everybody was included. So those were the people that were left behind, and it's not something that you do intentionally. It's actually something that happened without us noticing. So this is why the UK government, and looking into all of its projects, decided to be part of the Leave No One Behind pledge. So this pledge was part of the 2030 agenda, along with the Sustainable Development Goals, in which the UK government said they will prioritise to work that targets of most vulnerable and disadvantaged and the most excluded will be captured, and they will make sure that those that are at risk or discrimination are not left behind. So what do we mean? We mean that every person has a fair opportunity in life, no matter where they are or who they are. People who are the furthest behind and have least opportunity, and every person should count. So when you're thinking about your projects, you have to think about the whole economy, or if you're thinking on focusing on a certain region, you have to think about everybody that is included there. Are we looking at how many men and women are there? How many people with disabilities are there? How can they benefit from our projects? How can we ensure that we don't leave them behind? So a few questions that you should ask yourself, and they should be part of your planning, and it should help you, is to think about, first of all, when you're planning your projects, think about who might be left behind. So if I am developing an appliance, who can't use this appliance? So instead of focusing only on who can, think about who can't and why they can't and how you can include them. Is it people with disabilities? It could be they can't hear, they can't see. It could be people who can't read or write, etc. So depending on what you are developing, think about who is left behind within my project, within my concept. And then think about the second question to ask yourself is, why are these people going to be left behind when I develop my project? How can I include them? The third thing is taking action and in these groups of people and thinking about, okay, these are marginalized groups that I've identified. What can I do in my project to make sure they are included? And then the fourth point is the SDG 5 indicators. So we'll talk about them in a bit, and we'll talk about what they are. How can I select one or two to include in my program to represent that I have focused on women and girls and minorities? Okay, next slide. So how does LAYER, our program, incorporate gender? So first of all, we make sure that we are in line with the Gender Equality Act. So we have looked at all of our interventions from the moment they started, and we've made sure that they are targeting men and women and minority groups. We have looked for opportunities where we feel that we can make a positive impact on women and girls and people who might be at risk. We've included them. We have also used, you might not be familiar with, these definitions, so they're indicators and targets, but part of the monitoring valuation. We set indicators. For example, if we have a refrigerator that is going, is on the market and has been developed, we look at how many men, how many women are able to purchase them, how they will benefit men, women, children, people with disabilities, and then that's what we measure with our indicators, and we set targets to make sure we meet them. In the fourth way that Leah incorporates gender is also looking at value for money. So we look at cross-cutting indicators across all of our different projects and work streams, and we look at how we can make the most of our money that we have, or our project spend, to make sure that we are able to let individuals benefit the most with and get the most value out of the projects we're implementing. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. So how to consider gender and inclusion. So the energy sector is quite a difficult sector when we're looking at different areas of how we can include women, whether it's women who have worked in the energy sector, or whether it's people with disability that have worked in the sector. You might be thinking, where do I find the women, that the projects that I'm working on, or the appliances that I'm looking to develop women. And I know a project that we were working on, we were listening to in our other work stream, the R&D grants. They said, so what do we do? How can we make sure that with all the challenges in this sector, that we make sure that we are reaching enough women and children, people with disabilities, and also that there could be opportunities. So there's 3 different levels for incorporating gender inclusion, and we don't have to aim for all of them. We don't want to set ourselves up for failure. So what there is, there's 3 levels. One is called the minimum level of inclusion. The second is the empowerment level, and the third is transformational. So you can start with the minimum and say, will my project provide basic needs for women and marginalized groups? So by purchasing our product, or by developing it, or however we're planning our project, will it allow basic needs to be delivered? Yeah. And the second one is empowerment. So can I empower people through my project? And the third one is transformational. Can what I am developing my project be transformational? So there's 3 different levels. So aim for the level that you feel you can within your project. Don't look to overachieve. So they're the 3 levels. Okay, we can go to the next slide now. So I've given examples here, and Sean can share the slides with you. So how Leah has actually done that. So when we're looking at how we can go for level 1, which is voice, and allowing people to have voice. So we're ensuring that men and women are more resilient. We work with solar water pumps to make sure that the poor smallholder farmers, and 50% of them are women, are able to access the solar water pumps, are able to purchase them with installments, and then they will be able to have a voice making decisions on their products and what they farm and what they don't and how they sell them. The second level, which is choice. So we have the design challenge. So we have lots of males and females all participating from all different universities, and by participating, you have the choice to decide what project you're gonna work on and how you're going to influence others, and that provide jobs for women and provide opportunities also for women and benefits for men and women and people with disability within those projects. So there's different levels that you could choose from, and I'm happy to answer any questions on this later on. So if we can jump to the next slide. I know I have a lot of slides and a lot of information. So Emily, how do we plan for gender and inclusion? So this is our layer theory of change, and I'm just going to quickly, fast as I can, look at, we got different activities. Outputs is where we start, and then outcomes is what we expect to achieve. So if you look into all of these different activities that we're doing, consider where are the women, where are the people with minorities, and how can my activities in the beginning and output lead to these people benefiting outcome. So that's how we look to include the beneficiaries, women, people with disabilities, all different people you want to include in the beginning, and then you'll be able to see the results at the end of the project. Okay, the next slide is if we can jump to the next slide. So these are some considerations, so just get your thoughts triggered when you start planning. So again, we'll share them with you. So they're gender and inclusion checklists. So when you're thinking about the content, have I thought about women? Who's my target consumers? Who will benefit? Is it affordable? Am I directing it as household, women only? There's all different questions that you look at. Is it clear how women and men and youth and minorities are going to benefit? So these are just questions to trigger your mind on gender and inclusion as you plan out your project. I won't go through them all, but then they can also be shared. Next slide. Okay, so sustainable development goals. This should say sustainable. These are not the most updated slides, so it's okay. So as you can see, we've got a clown juggling all different sustainable goals, and the reason for that is when you're thinking about sustainable goal SDG 5, there's also different ones that will have a knock-on effect, and that's what I'm going to quickly talk about now in the next slide. Okay, so Leah does not only work on SDG 5, it also works on SDG 8, 7, and 13. So we look at how we can ensure that we are impacting women and people with disabilities and lots of people within the economy. But then we're also looking at climate change, and we're also looking at job creation. So if you're creating jobs for women, or your project will allow you jobs to be created for women, so that means you're working on SDG 8 and 5 at the same time. If your project is leading to affordable and clean energy, that's 7. So you've got 3 of them. So it's not only one, but there's a knock-on effect where it will result in more than one SDG. So look at all the different SDGs and see how many you can include. Okay, now the next slide. We can skip this one. This is just our layer SDGs. We mentioned that. Okay, so if you're working and your product is going to be sold in different countries where poor people will be impacted, so you will also be touching on SDG 1. So that this is the SDG. There's many the SDG indicators for each SDG. There's quite a few indicators. So equal rights to ownership of basic services of technology and resources, and then that is the SDG indicator. And then if you look below, we have layers SDG indicator that looks at how many people are benefiting, household savings, time saving, increased productivity, and all that will lead to reduced poverty of women, men, families. So it also incorporates SDG 5, so we can use 1 and 5 as Leah has. The second slide. So and this is just showing you how from the beginning of the project we have looked to actually achieve that SDG 1, which is nobody's that have been supported. And then we were looking at R&D projects that have enabled people to have more better well-being and livelihood, and then people have access to energy. And then that's how we have what's called a causal pathway to lead to measuring that impact. So it's things they're going to benefit to reach that SDG. The next one is 5. There we go. This is the SDG 5. So ensuring full participation in leadership and decision making. That is portion of women in marginalized positions, and providing women and girls with equal access to education, healthcare. That's another one that you could choose. We work on supporting jobs. We're helping smallholder farmers able to sell crops and be in better positions within their economy, which means they might go to university, which means that they might be able to take their children to better schools or provide better healthcare. So we are impacting SDG 5 and 1. So think about your SDGs and how many you can include. Next slide is also, I'll just leave that with you to look at how at each level we've done that. Okay, and then in the annex, just quickly to show you, there is examples of different indicators. This might be something that we could include. So there's quite a few of them, and Sean will share them with you later on. I'm happy to answer any questions by emails or on the chat later in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sheree. I don't know if you can see me yet, but it's great to be able to ground this conversation in the SDGs and understand how we can fit them into our projects and measure our own work against them. And I think that's something important for the students, for them to understand it in relation to the SDGs as defined in the assessment criteria. We're in the decade of action now, so it's great to hear about that. Okay, so Jennye, do you like to take it away? Let me just get your slides ready again. Thanks, Sheree.
You for the introduction, and thank you, Sheree, for setting the table in terms of the LEA program's approach to inclusion. That was great. So you can go to the next slide. So I think Sean already covered this. The one thing I wanted to point out is the reason I'm here today is because a year or two ago, I did a small assignment for the LEA program on gender inclusion. So that's how I came to know and become familiar with some of the work that y'all are doing. Next slide. So one thing I want to talk about is the importance of context and understanding energy users, and that there's some differences between a context where there's just energy poverty, but everybody is equal, and designing for that context looks very different from a context where, say, there's no energy poverty, but there's high levels of inequality, say gender inequality. It's a different design challenge. And every time you layer another aspect on top, like in a situation where there's energy poverty, and then on top of that, you have gender inequality, and then on top of that, you have rural or geographic exclusion, and then on top of that, you have other types of discrimination. It just means that you have to think of each of those layers, and they'll compound each other, and it really makes it a much more nuanced design exercise. Next slide. So this is a little history of gender and energy. There's a children's book called If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. So if you give a mouse a cookie, he'll want a glass of milk. If you give him milk, he'll want a napkin. If you give him a napkin, he'll want, and on and on and on. And that's sort of what I see what happened with the gender and energy discourse starting in the 1970s. Next slide. So in the 70s, there was really a focus on women, like biological women, and cooking, and women were seen as victims. And then in subsequent decades, you see this space clamoring for more and more broader, broader rights, broader definitions, broader concepts of women and energy, and it becomes gender and energy. And instead of thinking of women, we start to look at the social constructs, gender norms. We start to think about the roles that people play based on their gender, and it moves away from just cooking to small scale electricity. And then from there to larger scale electricity applications, to women in policy making, to women in the energy workforce at the highest echelons. And so there's been this real evolution over time, which is good to be aware of. But as it's grown, I feel like we can't forget all the things that came before. Just because cooking was a focus in the 1980s doesn't mean it's not still a problem today. Next slide. So, from any elementary physics class, I think we've all had teachers that have said, energy is the ability to do work. So here I've put at the top, energy plus appliances translates into the ability to do work. And oftentimes society has determined that work is gender segregated. So some people work and they receive monetary compensation. They're able to accumulate wealth. They receive a lot of prestige. And some people's work, oftentimes a lot of care work, a lot of subsistence agricultural production, reproductive work, raising children, is still work, but it doesn't lead to the same outcomes as the wage labor. So the fact that energy and appliances plays this key role in setting up, this economic cycle, and the way it differs sometimes for men and women, depending on where they live and what norms exist there, I think is important to keep in mind. Next slide. So here you can see there's a ancient Egyptian painting of a man plowing with some oxen, I guess, and a woman walking behind him. And I just wanted to point out that, the plow and draft animals was a real energy revolution. The invention of the plow and harnessing animals allowed people to increase by like a factor of 8 the amount of energy that got translated onto the field where they were growing their crops. So that's pretty revolutionary. And what's interesting is that even today, you can look at societies and the amount of patriarchy, how patriarchal there are and how much gender discrimination exists. And it still correlates to the type of soil in those places and whether the soil was amenable to being plowed. And in places where plow agriculture took off, it became the domain of men for a couple of reasons. The plow requires a lot of upper body strength. So men are kind of advantaged in that respect. It's also capital intensive because it requires these large animals, which are very expensive. And it was difficult to start and stop quickly. So women who often had to take care of, small children, it was not something that they could do at the same time. Whereas with hoe-based agriculture, men and women more typically worked side by side and small children could be present. And so in places where the soil did not support plow agriculture, there was more hoe-based agriculture. We actually see more gender equality even today because of the way that this fundamentally energy technology transformed society because of different gender roles. Next slide. So thinking about, obviously the plow is a pretty ancient technology, but thinking about technology today, and I don't mean to pick on anyone, but if you look on the left-hand side, you see what looks like a very tall man standing next to a mill, and you can see that the hopper height is really high, and probably it requires a lot of upper body strength to lift up bowls of grain and process it. And that might disadvantage women who on average are shorter, who on average have less upper body strength. Whereas on the right-hand side, you see some newer milling equipment, in this case developed by Agsol. And you can see there's a couple of things stand out. So they're tabletop devices. So you could actually have the table be at any height that you need that's comfortable for you. Smaller batch processing, more easy to operate with one hand in a lot of cases. Sometimes women, for example, they're multitasking, especially if they have small children or breastfeeding. And so having appliances that can be operated with one hand in a safe fashion can be really important. Also devices that, I don't think I have a picture of this, but sometimes you see mills and there's a lot of like exposed belts, running, which can be really dangerous if women have looser clothing that can get trapped in those belts. So again, that's just one more thing to think about. Next slide. I like this quote. This was from Dominique Laudemont. She worked at the World Bank, was the head of SMAP, and she said, where there's no infrastructure, women become the infrastructure. And by that she meant, where there's no piped water, women oftentimes carry the water. Where there's no, roads or transportation, a lot of, women and men also, will manually carry goods, to and from. And then one thing, as I was reflecting on this just last week, is that where there is infrastructure, we really have to consider the risk that it may be appropriated by people who are in more privileged positions of power, vis-a-vis each other. Next slide. So this I thought was interesting. I didn't know this until just a year or so ago, but originally the word computer referred not to a machine, but a person. It was usually a female mathematician who would perform astrological calculations for male scientists. And the first manual for computers, the machines that were eventually invented, was written by women, and they were really key in the early development of computers, the machines. And then as we can see in the ensuing decades, computers became very much associated with male professions and male work in that respect. So I wanted you to have the idea of appropriation in your mind, because there are good aspects of appropriation, because it means fundamentally the uptake, of technology. And we want people to, take up this technology, but to do it in a way that doesn't reinforce labor segregation. And we don't want one gender or one ethnic group or one anything to sort of claim all of the technology for itself and use that technology as a means to exclude other people. Next slide. So here's some ideas just that I had about how to prevent bad appropriation, or encourage positive appropriation. I think you see in the top right corner, the solar mamas, based off the barefoot college model, where women, usually middle-aged or older women, sometimes, with very low levels of literacy, sometimes not even sharing a common language, are able to learn how to assemble and repair small PV systems. And I think that's important, because when people understand how something works and they can repair it themselves, it's very hard to appropriate that away from them, because they possess familiarity with it, they possess the knowledge to work with it. So that's one idea. Another, I have a picture of a woman driving a tractor, which maybe is a response to, the traditional plow that requires, it's hard to start and stop and requires so much upper body strength. I have a picture of a man cooking, because one of my colleagues in her PhD thesis discovered that when electric appliances were introduced into South African kitchens, it actually encouraged men to participate more in the cooking chores. So in that case, the new technology it weakened the gender division of labor within households. And then finally, over on the left, you see my personal hand drill. And it does have a smaller grip, because I have smaller hands, but it's also pink, which means that my male friends and relatives, pink in the US is like a very stereotypically female color. So now my male friends and relatives don't just take my drill and walk off with it, because they wouldn't be caught dead having a pink drill. And it's the only way I can protect my tools is to paint them all pink. So just some food for thought on that aspect. Next slide. Another thing that I want to talk about is the fact that, appliances, when households and businesses purchase them and use them, they become embedded in this context. They're placed somewhere, usually in a house or a business premise. If there's a grid, a weak grid, or a microgrid connection, you have to think about who, like in the society where you're designing for, who typically owns the house? And does the person who owns the house generally own the electricity connection running to that house? And if so, are they generally expected to pay the bills? And if they're generally expected to pay the electricity bills, does that sort of give them ownership and control over the selection of appliances that the household will bring in, and the use of the appliances that the household will bring in? And it seems like a lot, to be able to address these types of questions just through the design of a material object. But it can be done. I'm always thinking in the back of my head, when a household purchases something, who decided to buy it? Who was it marketed to? If the household splits up, like in the case of divorce, who is probably going to get the appliance and retain ownership of it? Things of that nature. And every society is going to be different. Some are patrilineal, some are matrilineal, matrilocal, patrilocal. It's just something that is worth investigating, in my opinion. And and then finally, on the subject of assets, in places where men typically own the primary asset, like land or a house, women may need extra thought, may need to be put into making appliances affordable for women if they have lower income and asset levels. particularly thinking about how to make the appliance financeable. So whether that's pay as you go, or sticking a really big warranty on it so that the bank has comfort, that the appliance is not going to break. There's different approaches to that as well. But addressing affordability, it has a gender and inclusion aspect as well, because people start from different points of asset and income levels. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have later on.
Okay, thanks, Jennye. That was fantastic. That was really great to hear. A note to say that I don't think we'll have time for an official Q&A section of the event, but so please write any questions that you might have in the chat, and the speakers can answer them there. But I won't keep you anymore. Next, we got Will Minter-Kemp up. Will, would you like to go ahead with your section?
Of course. Hopefully you can hear me, Sean.
Yes.
You can.
You
Great.
yeah.
Fantastic. And video might be there as well. Well, firstly, thank you for having me. My name's Will Minter-Kemp. I'm a technical project manager for Energy Saving Trust that works in the transport team. And Sean's asked me to come along today just to talk about one of the projects that we're doing, looking into inclusive design and some of the potential problems that are arising through the transition to electric vehicles. So Sean, if you go to the next slide, that'd be great. So the real purpose of this project, which was brought to us by Department for Transport, was to try and identify the barriers that disabled consumers are facing when switching to electric vehicles. And when we did this project, we split it into two main sections, and that's the process of getting an electric vehicle and what the barriers are for disabled consumers in there. And then also looking at what it's like to use an electric vehicle, whether that's charging or driving. What are the barriers that disabled consumers who have made the switch going to face through their day-to-day in that sense as well. Next slide, please. So just to set the scene really for a bit of context for the scale of this potential problem, in the UK there's 14.1 million disabled people, and that makes up an enormous proportion of people in the UK, something that obviously needs to be addressed if there's going to be potential issues transitioning to electric vehicles. Some other important numbers are 2.35 million disabled drivers and passengers have blue badges. So these are types of disabilities that mean that parking in an ordinary bay isn't necessarily possible, and therefore need some form of priority parking with additional considerations around space of the vehicle, and sort of being able to open your door or have wheelchair access to various parts of curbs and pavements. There's some concerning figures about the number of people who are potentially going to have to rely on on-street charging. And although there is on-street provision in the UK for charge points, something that is concerning is that 0.39 million disabled consumers are unlikely to have adequate on-street charging. And this means that there is either nothing on their immediate street or in their local area. So that's a large number of people that potentially could be caught out by this lack of infrastructure. Next slide, please. So looking at some of the barriers for getting an EV, and you might read through this list here and think that a lot of this will be shared with consumers who don't necessarily have a disability, and you'd be definitely right in thinking that, but there are definitely some more nuanced ways in which these different categories impact people with disabilities. So starting off with lack of information, there generally speaking is quite a lot of information on electric vehicles and charging. However, what this information is lacking is something that really brings home to that individual consumer what having an electric vehicle would be like for them. There might be information about charge points or how to charge, but it doesn't necessarily work out for that person to make them be able to make the decision if they could actually switch to an electric vehicle, not for them specifically. As you can imagine, people don't want to run out of electricity in their cars or have too short a range. And this problem is potentially made worse when having a disability where the consequences of being left stranded are potentially a lot higher. And that goes for the same as charging as well. Having a shorter range means more reliance potentially on public infrastructure, and there is a perception of charging infrastructure of it not being adequate for the disabled consumer. Some of the big points really in the getting an EV are the suitability though of the actual product, the actual electric vehicle, for particularly those with mobility or dexterity disabilities. So for wheelchair accessible vehicles, electric vehicles haven't really been able to replicate what we can do with internal combustion engine vehicles, and that's to do with the placement of the battery. In electric cars, batteries are normally placed on the lower side of the vehicle along the floor, where previously ramps used to be installed. However, now we can't install ramps in the same way because of where those batteries are placed and because of the potential dangers of moving any batteries around, which means that wheelchair accessible vehicles aren't necessarily possible at the moment with electric vehicles. So there are a couple of examples, they're certainly not widespread yet. Next slide, please. There are also barriers for when you're actually using an electric vehicle as well. And the fundamental one is the scarcity of charge points. So in the UK, there just aren't really enough charge points to be able to cater for all different disabled consumers, but wider speaking, general consumers as well. So this is a point that certainly needs to be addressed. But then of those charge points that are there are some quite large concerns about their accessibility themselves. And in the middle here, you can see there's two different ways in which charge points aren't necessarily accessible. That's the actual charge point themselves and the built environment around, the surroundings where the charge point's actually situated. So for some examples of some of the concerns that have been raised, there aren't necessarily dropped curbs being installed next to charge points, which means that wheelchair users can't necessarily get to access the charge point themselves, as they need that drop curb to be able to get onto the pavement. There are also potential issues about shelter, adequate lighting, and whether the built environment is equipped to be able to cater for someone who potentially needs additional support with amenities or toilets at the charge point when they're having to wait there for potentially up to an hour. The charge points themselves also have some issues. Things like the connector heights and how difficult they are to put in and out if you have a mobility, dexterity, disability, where moving items around that have weight behind them is difficult. Rapid charge point cabling is incredibly stiff and quite heavy, and this makes it difficult for some disabled consumers to be able to use them. But on a more top level version than that, even disabilities such as vision impairments, those people who wear glasses, many of the charge points are using interfaces, screens, which haven't necessarily been positioned in a place where they are protected from glare from sunlight, so people can't read what's on the screens, which makes using the charge points near on impossible, but also the type of instructions that are being put onto the actual interfaces and screens as well, and then potentially having difficulties among those with dyslexia or potentially other different types of learning disabilities. And finally, just one quick point on the consumer behavioural change. As you can imagine, having an electric vehicle can be really, really quite different to having an internal combustion petrol or diesel vehicle. And for a disabled consumer, having a routine is incredibly important for travel, as often it can be something that is vital for their independence, as well as safety for visits to hospitals or other different areas of their lives. And if I go to the next slide, please. Just to finish off on a more positive note, some of the solutions that are being looked at. So all these different stakeholders here are going to play a really important part in bringing solutions, one of which is developing standards, design standards for the automotive and the charge point industries to make sure that anything that they do design meets the requirements for all disabled consumers and not just general consumers. So I'm going to leave that there and hand back to Sean. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Will. It's great to hear some work that it's actually currently being done and understanding the whole area of transport and maybe inspire some of our students to work on transport projects. Last up, we've got Oluwadamilare, and we are running slightly over time. So Oluwadamilare, do you mind staying on a little bit longer in case your section goes a little bit longer? Just for a few minutes if you can.
Yeah, that's fine.
And anyone else that can do that, please stay on. So let me hand it over to you. I'm looking forward to it.
You hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you great.
Okay, super. Thanks, Sean. And thanks to all the speakers who have participated. I'll be talking about social inclusion, gender inclusion, more in the direction of mini grids, micro grids. Basically, because that's majorly what I do, and I will also just try to avoid repeating things. So,
Actually, we can't hear you quite all the time. So maybe if you just come closer to the mic, it just seems to come in and out a little bit. But otherwise,
okay, let me see if I have to hold the mic. Is it better?
yes, I think that's better.
Okay, I'll just hold the mic. Yes, I was saying I'll be speaking more based on my experience with mini grids, my microgrids energy access projects on this topic, and just so I also avoid covering what's said by the preceding speakers. Excellent. So, what is social inclusion? You take a look at the bus and you consider the bus as either a project or a product. Imagine a situation where you had to move from point A to point B by walking. That's a challenge. That's a pain point, right? But the introduction of a bus, which can take you faster, easier, solves that pain point, right? For men, women, children, older people. But then, is it really capturing enough value for everyone? Is the person with a disability able to do that same, take advantage of that same product without this disabled access, which is obviously shown in this picture? So these are like examples of things you think about in the design project process of products. You look at the building also. If I'm living in a building and I play football, I break a leg. If there's no disabled access, it means I can't go into my own building again. Right? So at that particular point, the building is not capturing a full value for me, and I'm unable to harness the full value of the building. So this is essentially what social inclusion is about: capturing all identities, ensuring everyone, every identity can all equitably access the value your product, your project is generating. Next slide, please. Yeah, and that's basically what I just said. Social inclusion is taking into account all identities of the target market, from women to differently abled people, children, or the population. Think about them from the initial stage of product or project design. Ensure that your project or product captures value for all the identities, and ensure that every group can harness the solution project or product offers. I mean, the whole focus of this is more towards the SDG 7, which focuses on ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. And probably the most important part of that goal is for all. But I was just at the SDG 7 pavilion here at the COP26, and 50% of the world conversation was encompassing social inclusion. If you look at climate impact and climate and the people who suffer it the most, you sort of sense a sort of social climate injustice, where the people who actually contribute the less are the ones who are suffering the most. And these are the people you really need to include. You cannot leave them behind. There's no sustainability if you don't capture the people who are really suffering. So this is what social inclusion entails: making sure everybody, literally everybody, can harness the solution. Next slide, please. So how do you design socially inclusive products? In 4 simple steps. Obviously, this can be expanded, but we'll just focus on these 4 simple steps. 1, you zero in on your target market. I think anyway, you do this for any project or product design process anyway. Then you identify as many groups as possible within the target market. Reality is, ideally, you want to identify all groups, but as design process and products is an iterative process, it is expected that at the beginning you will really not identify all, but it is imperative to try to identify as many as possible, and ideally all within your target markets. Then you move to the second point: you differentiate it and understand the needs of each individual group which you have identified. So it's basically putting yourself in the shoes of each individual group and simulate their activities. What are their pain points? What are their limitations? How can we encompass and bring these people into this design? How can they actually take advantage of the product or projects we're offering? These are the questions you ask in point 3. Does your project or products improve their lives? Does it only focus on a section of people? Does it only focus on men? Does it only focus on normally able people? Does it only benefit the youth? Does it marginalize unemployed locals? Is it accessible to all? Can it actually be used by all? And fourthly, it's a continuous process. You have to be open to feedback. You design, you redesign, and you adapt to both existing and even new groups towards inclusion. Next slide, please. The basic fundamentals of social inclusion, and you will see this if you actually just put a Google search. I didn't come up with it. It's quite a popular mantra. It basically revolves around three points. The first one is do no harm. Basically, in this category, you try to avoid unexpected risk of consequences that the project or product can create, such as gender-based violence, displacement from assets, land, housing, women's unpaid work. Basically, your project should not leave people worse than they were. No matter how bad they were, your project or product must not leave them worse. Then the second point is ensure equitable participation. So this particular point is to address gaps between identities, males, females, other identities in terms of participation, opportunities, and access to resources, including employment. You don't want to have a project or a product that majorly just employs men, because then it's focusing on just one identity and you're leaving others behind. And the third point, focusing on actively closing gender gap. Again, this goes back to understanding and addressing the challenges of each individual group so that you can actually try to close the gaps between each groups. Actually, I would actually reframe this as actively close identity gaps. Yeah, I prefer to call them identity groups, just because it's social inclusion. It's not really just about gender. So I'd rather use identities. Next slide, please. So I'll move a bit more into mini-grid and microgrid processes. And in recent years, mini-grid processes, especially in Africa, where I'm really familiar with, a lot of them fail. That's the reality. In spite of the whole push, sustainability, energy access, a lot of them fail. And it's simply because they don't capture enough value to the people. When these projects are directed to capture value from one sector, or a section of people, there will be parts of people who will be disillusioned and who wouldn't see the benefits of it. And the reality is, you want your project or product to capture more people. You want it to capture value from more people, because then you get more customers, right? Really, that's better for your project or product. So it's a win-win. And you sometimes see projects fail due to vandalism, theft, from certain people that feel left out, unemployed youths, possibly people who can't afford it, things like that, or possible people whose business focuses on a sort of alternative to your product. So you've got to think around all this in your design process. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a community in Nigeria that's just me during the community stakeholder engagement during the design process of a mini grid. And usually we focus on, just like I said, we focus on identifying all groups in the communities. You speak to the general community, then you go down, you break it down into the individual groups: men, women, youth, older population, smaller children. You listen and you actively understand their lives. And it's also important to approach this process with diverse teams. You see, we're about 4 here with the vest. 2 of us understand purely English, and the other 2 are more connected to these communities. They understand the language and they can really understand the pain points and explain it to us more explicitly. So it's important to have diverse teams who sort of push local representation, just so you can overcome some social and cultural barriers in understanding how to include these people in your design process. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is an example of an identified group in one of the sites. And this, as you would see across all the pictures, is women doing this hard work. This is actually Oluwadamilare. using dirty diesel generator, very stressful, operating them, gas emissions. Just look at the whole operation, quite dirty. You find out that women and other marginalized groups, they often face social and cultural barriers in public participation. And this is even more, there's more emphasis on this in the places without energy access. I'm very happy that projects and products of this of the challenges aim towards efficiency for access, because these are the points where you really see this marginalization with different identities. So what we did here is speak to these women, understand how the whole process works, understand their challenges. What do you not like about this operation? What can be improved? What would you like? And then you go back to your board and think, how can the mini grid project actually capture value for them? Because if you think about it, if you put a mini grid project in this community, if they have power in their houses, they are captured by it. But is it really fully inclusive for them? Are you actually eliminating the challenges? Are you reducing the limitations? So these are the things you want to think about. You want people, all identities, to be able to connect as much as possible with your projects. Next slide, please. So how did we approach this particular situation? We look outside our core responsibility as energy project developers. And you think about it, okay, fine. We can provide a mini grid project and also possibly provide actually, please move to the next slide. I already moved from this slide to the next slide. Yes, sorry. Yeah, we can provide a mini grid which gives them energy access, and we can possibly recommend energy efficient appliances, which are obviously cleaner, easier to operate, and would avoid a lot of the challenges they are facing. But then you look at it again, would these women actually be able to upfront afford a $3,000 equipment to ease their payments? The likely answer, in more often than not, it is no. Okay, so then you become a financier. You're an energy developer. Then you become a financier. Okay, fine. We will help you with this. We'll give you this on a finance note. You pay, whatever portion of the full fee, monthly, quarterly, etc. You teach them how to use, the equipment, and also give them business best practices around this. Now, you look at all this design consideration and you see that more value is being captured. Now they can fully get into this, avoid emissions, avoid stress. They do not have to commit a whole lot of capital, which they probably don't have, to switch into efficient appliances. And now they spend less time and effort on the same activities. As a result, they make better margins. They have increased disposable income to spend on the business for expansion and even other things, education, relaxation, and just this single design consideration has changed their lives and captured more value for them than it would have if you do not introduce it. Next slide. You look at another situation around cocoa, same community actually. This is cocoa drying, and it's a whole long and rigorous procedure where they actually sun dry it every day. They bring it out in the morning, evening, they take it back, and they have to wait 7 to 10 days every day. I mean, for every batch before they're able to sell it. And this is another thing you have to do. Now, this particular institution is not gender specific. It is an identity, because the identity here is cocoa farmers, right? And you want to capture them also in the project. Next slide, please. I will speak about how they were captured. Next slide, please. Again, this is another identity, mostly women in the DRC, fish sellers. There's zero infrastructure for cold chain, and they have to throw away every fish that was caught on the same day. If they don't sell it, they have to throw it away. Next slide, please. And what's the solution to this? We incorporate all these various drying, cold chain into the whole project. Oil milling, you incorporate it in the project as a centralized hub. You employ those same people in that identity to operate that hub, so they are not committing the capital or anything, but they are in the know-how anyway. So you employ them to actually operate it. teach them best business practices, trainings, financial discipline, and they basically become your partners. You capture more value for their products. For them, they get increased margins. You don't saddle them with financial credits. You're employing them in the process, and just increase community buying because they all want to actually make that succeed because it's working. Overall, you see that with these processes, your product stand a better chance at success because they can actually be finessed by all identities. Next slide, please. Yeah, I just thought to include these slides, these points, which you might find helpful during your design stage of the challenge. You might find these links helpful for gender mainstream toolkits, SMAPs, and REPPs. Next slide. Yeah, thank you very much. I hope I've been able to inspire you a bit. I know I focus more on mini grids, but the whole concept of design, social inclusion is generally the same. Identify all kinds of groups, understanding the limitations. And I look forward to seeing your projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oluwadamilare. That was great. It was great to close out the session and get some practical elements in there. Really think about the students' real designs and think of some projects that are happening at the moment. So thank you for sharing those. We've run over time. I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry for holding you all here, but and we don't quite have time for Q&A. But if you have any questions, please send them to the Efficiency for Access Design Challenge email address, and we'll try to answer all of those questions. We didn't get any in the chat at the moment. So thank you to all of our speakers. It was wonderful having you here. I really didn't want to cut any of you off because you had such rich presentations. I think today's session was really great, really beneficial for the students. So thank you all for coming. For any students that can stay for 1 or 2 more minutes, if you could please complete this feedback survey. That QR code is on the screen, and the link is in the chat. Can you please complete that before you leave? That would be really beneficial for us. Be able to improve these sessions as we move forward through the year. And this, as well as all of the slides, all of the resources that our speakers have shared, we'll be sharing those in the post-webinar email that will be going out today. So look out for that, as well as the recording and everything else associated with the webinar. So anyone that can complete this, please do so. And finally, if you haven't signed up for the newsletter, feel free to sign up there. So you'll get all of our important news about the Efficiency for Access Design Challenge there, as well as the upcoming webinars, any events coming up. We have some events coming up soon. We have a webinar next week, next Monday, which you'll hear shortly about. And we have a few exciting mentor opportunities and prototyping opportunities that we'll be launching this month. So look out for all of those and look out for the newsletter. Thank you again all for coming. It's been a great session, and sorry for holding you here, but I hope you found it useful. Again, thank you to our speakers, and have a nice day.